So hey everyone, my name is George. I'm one of the content developers here with OffSec. Today, I'm super excited to have the opportunity to kind of just showcase Web 100. So I've been working on, myself and my team have been working on these modules. So I'm going to give an overview of what we have here. And then based on the results from the polls that went out to all the social media platforms, web attacker methodology was the one that got the most votes. So depending on time, I may pull another one and just kind of quickly look through, but that's kind of like today's focus is going to be looking over into the web attacker methodology and just kind of showcasing how we lay out our material, how we interact with our labs. Speaking of interaction, I do hope you all can kind of interact with me. I'm going to ask some questions, so I'll pay attention to the chat. If you do have questions in the meantime, feel free to drop them. I will make them easy. I will do my best to answer them. So once you log in, here you see the Web 100 modules. Some of these are overlap with other ones, like Linux, Bash scripting. They do exist in some of the other, I guess, learning paths. Is what we call them. So like the Pen 100, SOC 100. But some of them are specific to web. So like web application, JavaScript basics, web attacker methodologies. And if this is the first time you've seen this, the next column is kind of like when you last accessed that module. And then you have two kind of like progress bars, shows you like if you just kind of click through it, what your progress is, and if you completed the exercises. And then if you've kind of completed the whole thing, you can kind of mark it as complete. So as you can see here on my account, I've done the JavaScript basics module, and that's why it's green here. So let's jump into got a sneak peek. So the way this is laid out is you have different learning units. So you can see, oops, can I close this? There we go. Oh, that brought me out. Oh, sorry. Okay, let's do this. So you can see there's like 6 different learning units. It's also on the left side, and it's just basically broken down into, more specific kind of like sections. So that's how it starts off, like, hey, in this topic or module, here are the learning units that, are going to be covered, just so you can kind of see ahead of time what all you can expect. So there's going to be an introduction to web application assessments, and then we're going to like walk through all the different phases. If you're kind of familiar with this, then you'll know the different phases. But if not, these are just usually like the general phase of what you would do. You would enumerate, do some kind of vulnerability discovery. So once you've identified what kind of application or programs are running and services, then you kind of go further into, okay, what which version is any of it exploitable. You go into your exploitation phase, and then once you've gained some kind of access, that's when you can go into post exploitation, and then finally reporting. So let's go into the next one. Yes. Sorry, I'm also paying attention to the chat. I think, does that help? Is it still, can you guys read it? Thank you. Okay, awesome, appreciate it. So let's go into the first learning unit. So in this first learning unit, we just kind of have like an overview of web application assessments. So here it talks about the scope. And really it's just kind of like a conversation between you and the client, just trying to figure out, okay, like the objectives, what's in play, what isn't in play. Then this is very important because it comes down to, to time, to money, to, if it's like, hey, don't touch production server or, whatever, that's super important, because if you accidentally do something that's, out of scope and it, it messes things up, like that can be super critical, in a negative way. No, this is not the office hour. So really, like, that's one of the main things that you want to start off whenever you do a web application assessment, is just kind of like identify the scope, talk with the client to figure out what are some of the things that they're concerned about. And it's gonna, like I said, it's going to be a two-way conversation at the beginning until you've, come to some kind of agreement. And then it's like, okay, great, we both agreed on this, we're ready to, move forward. Another big thing that people kind of like trying to figure out the differences is like, okay, what's the difference between a web application assessment and a penetration test? What do you all think? I'm sure there's some individuals here that have had experience, so I'm kind of curious if you guys could drop them in the chat. So somebody says assessment doesn't exploit. So it can be. I guess it just depends on like the scope and the definition. I guess in this sense, I can see, yeah, if you're just doing like scanning, but really one of the big differences here is web application is more geared towards just like that, like web applications. When you're talking about a penetration test, it's kind of like a bigger scope. It's not just, the web servers. There may be, a mail server. There may be kind of like other, other aspects of the network that may be in play or in scope. Yeah. So that's kind of like the biggest, really the biggest difference. Phases, so I kind of like touched on that, which is where we're gonna get to, but you have a general 5 phases, depending on the framework that you kind of look at. There may be different nuances, but at the end of the day, these phases are what is going to come down to. You're gonna enumerate or identify kind of like the initial information of like what type of services, what type of systems are they, the versions, identify if they're, vulnerable to any sort of exploits, and then actually, exploit them, if it's within scope, and continue with the post exploitation. So whether that means privilege escalation or lateral movement, again, if it's within scope, and finally reporting. Reporting is not everyone's favorite, but that's kind of where the customer is going to get the most bang out of its buck. So let's jump into enumeration. So another thing I kind of forgot to mention, when you're opening up these learning units, so at the top over here, you have like learning objectives. So if this is your first time seeing this, this is just kind of like things that you're going to, or objectives that you're going to encounter within the learning unit. So for like this one, you want to understand the importance of enumeration, how to identify web application techniques, automated scans in terms of like enumeration, and finally the concept of attack surface. So it's not always a one-for-one. Just because there is a learning objective here, it doesn't mean like oh, you're gonna cover that learning objective within this first section. But it's just an easy, quick way, for you to kind of look over and just, kind of like know what to expect. So let's jump into the web stacks. So in this section talks about the web stack, and basically it's different pieces of software that kind of support like what you would think of like a traditional website. Not everything would have like this exact kind of framework, but you can think in general. There's going to be an operating system. There's going to be a server, likely a database of some sort, and then you've got a programming language. So the LAMP web stack really was one of the most common web stacks that has been and even it's still used today to some extent, but really came from the first letter of each piece of software. So Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP. And that's just one of many. Like, don't get too hung up on, the exact like acronym. This is just kind of like a popular example. What's the biggest takeaway from here is that, you can expect kind of like those, whether it's an operating system, a database, a server, and a programming language. Hey, how's it going? You can expect those types of things. So whenever you're in the enumeration phase, that's kind of like the information that you want to gather, or like a good starting point, So as we scroll down, just talks about more information about kind of like the web stack, the different technologies. And here we have our first listing. So listings are important because they kind of provide the code for some of the things, whether it's like things that you can do hands-on yourself, or which most of the time that is, or just kind of like an example, like a code snippet. And in this example, we actually can do this hands-on. So again, if this is your first time here, we're big on hands-on. So there are two main ways to connect to our environment. You can either download a VPN pack and then have kind of like your own virtual machine where you can connect using that VPN pack. It's not, super involved, but it is more involved than just using the in-browser Kali. So today we're gonna go ahead and do that just because it's like kind of easier. The one downside that I will mention to using the in-browser Kali is that once your instance is like turned off, like you lose all your work. So yeah, definitely hands-on is definitely the best. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so I have used the in-browser before. So like I said, it's convenient to just kind of like spin it up and jump straight into the work. But know that you will have to move your or save your work offhand, to your own basically system, because otherwise you will lose it. So here it talks, okay, how do we get this information? And specifically here it talks about the HTTP headers. And if you're not familiar with it, this is what I love about kind of like our material, is that if you go back here and you're like, oh man, I don't quite know what HTTP header means, we can jump into this web application and it literally talks about request headers. So you see the HTTP headers, response headers. So, you can kind of, get more familiar and you're like, okay, great. Now I have a better understanding of HTTP headers. I can jump back into where I was at. But essentially it's like metadata that goes back and forth between the client and the server. And what will happen is either on the request or on the response side, there will be some kind of information, not always, but this is what you want to look for. They'll kind of reveal one of those pieces of technology, whether it's a server or an operating system. So it's really important to pay attention to these. When you just browse through the browser, you don't see that information. That information does exist. So there are other tools out there to kind of see that. And one of the tools that we're going to use is curl. Let's see. This may be a bit out of scope. that is a little bit out of scope. I wish I could do that. We do not have. I'm just reading the chat. We are not going to have enough time to really jump into that. If we do, though, I'll keep that in mind. So curl is one of those tools that you can use. Burp is another one. Yeah, curl is great. So what we want to do is scroll down here to resources. And here we have the virtual machine. So we're going to go ahead and start that. Wait while that boots up. But essentially, curl is kind of like a command line client that you can use to request web pages. And here we have a specific option. It's the tag I, which says like, hey, I want, like, send me this data, like this web page, but I want you to also include the header information. And this is basically what we see here. This is all the header information that normally you wouldn't see just by browsing. And as you can see, one of the first pieces of information, which is highlighted here, is the server. And it says like, hey, this is 2.4.38 Apache. It also informs us that it's running on a Debian operating system. So very crucial. We've got the type of software, we've got the version, and we have the operating system. And these can definitely be ways where we can identify vulnerabilities and ways to exploit them. But yeah, so there's different types of headers. Another one that it mentions here is the xpower by response header. It'll sometimes leak other server software. But yeah, there's, obviously we can't like cover comprehensively, but bottom line is you want to look out for these headers, which can reveal information that, allows you to move forward. Down here, it basically says like, well, we can do this manually. So this would be like a manual method. There are automated tools. So like Nmap, Burp is also a pretty good tool to where it just helps you identify based on different, like it says here, TCP fingerprinting is one of them, but there's other ways to kind of identify things. And sometimes it's a best guess, it's not going to be exact. That's kind of like that with all automated tools. You're just going to have to, it just comes with experience, but there are automated tools that you can use to help you leverage, information gathering. All right, so now that we have the machine, we got some exercises. So again, the point of this is not just to present the material, but hands-on. We've talked about how important that is. So sometimes there will be knowledge-based questions, but we do try most of the time to have hands-on, because that's, for most people, what is going to help you learn the best. So we've started the VM, and then it says you use a tool of your choice to access the index page. So really the index page is like your default, your home page. Whenever you start a web server, just by default, that's going to be like your main page that's going to appear. And then we need to inspect the headers. So we're going to go back to, so here we have our terminal. So like I said, there are many tools that we can use, but we've seen curl. So let's just go ahead and use that. So here it has the website. That is one way to, or that like the URL, I should say. That is one way to do it. Another way is to use the actual IP address. That kind of takes into a whole nother conversation. But there are other modules to kind of explain the relationship with that. So this module does kind of assume you're coming into things with some knowledge. So some things aren't like as obviously explained. So if you're not familiar with it, that's when you may have to go back to some of the previous modules to kind of like gain that knowledge. So we got our curl, we got our attack eye, which says like, hey, I want the headers, and we are going to provide the IP address. So what I'm doing here is just kind of a way to copy paste information between like the host, or I should say like the actual operating system that I'm on, compared to the in-browser Kali instance, just because of the way things work. This is kind of like how you copy paste material, and you can follow that same process backwards, if that makes sense. Okay, oops. Okay, so we've sent that, and we've got some results. So what does everyone think? What's some useful information we can gather from here? No, there should be one off the bat. There is a flag. Yep. So we have the server, right? That's pretty good. We got the flag, so we can go ahead and select that. And as you can see, it appeared here. Now we can copy it. Yep, the X powered by header. So that's just a way to, we found the flag, we've provided it. But yeah, that was one of the headers, that is good to pay attention to. In this instance, it just provided us with a flag. In the real world, it's obviously not going to be a flag. It's going to be information that you can actually leverage and use. So the next question talks about the via header, and you're like, oh man, I don't quite know what via header is. I mean, I know it says waitress. This doesn't mean much to me. Well, great. Let's just jump on Google and Google via header waitress. So what comes up? Pylons. So it looks like, oh, here we go. Waitress is meant to be a production quality pure Python server. Okay, so this looks like some type of a Python server. Very good information. The fact that we know it's used in Python could again, information that we could use to exploit the system. Here's another website, and yep, sure enough, it's got the same thing. So, and this is big into what you're going to do in the enumeration phase. You're not going to know every piece of technology. No one is, even with experience. Like there may be things that you will know ahead of time, or you're going to like come across more than once. But there are going to be many times, and you're like, I have no clue what this is, and this is where research is going to be your best skill, to identify, the basically like self-learn. So what programming languages? Well, we identify that as Python. If an application return the error message. All right, so what would we do here? I have no clue what this error message is. So what would I do? Oh yeah, definitely. I can definitely bump that up. Yeah, Google it. Sort of like I have no clue what error 1146 means, but as soon as you Google it, man, Google knows. So table doesn't exist. Let's see, the error occurs when a table does not exist in the MySQL database. Hey, this is pretty useful. We know it's a MySQL database. So again, whenever you're interacting, like I said, the biggest takeaway from here is you want to interact with a web server in many different ways. And you're just trying to see, like, how does it react? What are some of the things, whether it's, verbose error messages or, I mean, different messages that it's going to provide, whether it allows input or it doesn't. With you interacting, like giving it different, I guess, information, how is it going to respond? And those responses might reveal some information, even if it's an error, such as this, where you're like, this doesn't, by itself, it doesn't reveal it. But if you Google it, now you've identified, what kind of database this is, which is huge. Now you have, a better way, essentially a plan of attack to move forward. So like I said, the database is going to be one of the most popular things you're going to, likely come across whenever you're talking about a website. Nowadays, everything has, some type of a login. So with login means databases. So there's going to be some type of user enumeration, most likely. And one of the things, like I mentioned before, that you want to look for is different responses. So like if it has invalid username, well, this is good, right? Because if I type in a username and it just says incorrect password, then that means that username is a correct username. Now, if I type in another username and then it says invalid username, that further solidifies that, okay, the second username that I've tried does not exist, but the first one does. You don't have to always like get the first, like credentials on the first go. You can pay attention to these messages to identify, like, okay, well, now I've got, a pair of usernames that I know, based on the system error, I know work. So now I can try to brute force the password. And really that just like helps with, like your time. So here we have another machine we're going to start up. So here we say, use the password reset functionality to determine which of these users listed above are valid. Okay. So what we can do, 192.168. So we can go back here. We'll open up our browser. We'll browse there, and we'll just kind of see what's going on. But yeah, even though, there are some limitations to the browser, it's still pretty powerful. We don't go into like developer tools, but there are definitely ways to utilize a browser to your advantage. So don't take it for granted. 192.168.52. Okay, so here's a fictitious company. And what was one of the mark.styles? I can enter whatever, it doesn't really matter. No, don't save. Okay. Forgot password. So let's try here, see what happens. Username not found. What about, let's try this one at the bottom. Another username not found. What about Kenneth.force? Oh, well, there you go. So we know that Kenneth.force is a legitimate user. So that's, now we're like that much closer. We have a legit username. And now we could throw a password list. If you didn't have this, you would have to throw a username list and a password list, and it would just take so much longer. But basically, that's what you want to kind of shoot for, are those kind of different error messages, where it says like, oh, username does not exist, or username not valid, or something as simple as like forgot password. And it's like, okay, password recent email was sent to your email, which confirms that, or it could confirm that that user exists. And if that, here, so we kind of touched up a little bit on automated enumeration tools. In this section, we just have additional tools, so like Derb, Dirbuster, GoBuster. The biggest difference between all of these is some of them are command line, some of them are GUI. At the end of the day, they kind of all do the same thing. Vulnerability scanners, like Nessus, there are other ones out there. And then I mentioned Burp. But yeah, so all these tools, that's one of the biggest things that you can use them for, is to crawl a site, to identify those like login pages, or robots.txt, which, if you don't know, it's just another kind of like page that the web server can present, or information that you can use. So while manual is good in some instances, automated tools are also good to kind of help you, especially if you've got like 1,000 pages. Like, you don't have time to check each page out. So use the automated tools to kind of help you narrow down, and then you can use more manual methods to kind of like get in a little bit deeper on, once you've identified other pieces of information. And then really your attack surface, that's basically, I mean, we've kind of like, this just kind of like concludes what we've talked about in enumeration, right? So you use these tools, you identify the services, you identify whether it's usernames, and then you kind of prepare yourself for the next phase, which is the vulnerability discovery. Same thing as the enumeration. In the vulnerability discovery phase, you can use automated tools to attempt exploitation for some of these. Just know that there are false positives, just like any automated tool. Like, it's not going to be perfect, so you don't want to fully rely on them. If something says, oh, it is vulnerable, you absolutely want to confirm that in maybe in a manual method, or just something else where you can like confidently tell the customer, because you don't want to like bring a list of things to the customer and be like, yeah, automated tool said these are vulnerable, and at the end of the day they're all false positives. Like, that's that doesn't help them. That's not a good look. But then manual testing is kind of like where you don't want to always use it, but it definitely does help in other instances, whether it's confirming or going a little bit deeper into some of the results that you got from the automated scans. In this little section, it just talks about unexpected input. That's kind of like a whole other like section of vulnerabilities within websites. So like injection, whether it's SQL injection or cross-site scripting, somebody mentioned that earlier. But yeah, it does get fairly in depth. And this is just like, there's just not enough time to like really cover it in depth here. but there are other ones. I think there's like a intro to cross-site scripting that module that you can do. Another thing that talks about here is source code analysis. There are different ways to do this. Depending on the customer, they may provide this to you and they may say like, hey, we want you to analyze the source code of the web server, whatever it may be. So that may be one way. Other times you may get a compiled version. So you may have to like reverse engineer the code. And that's what it talks about here. And just to kind of get like, okay, what are the settings for, how is this web server configured? But, obviously like that's going to be a little bit harder. That's going to take a little more time. And then lastly, just, components with known vulnerabilities. So like if whatever Apache version that was, if there are, known vulnerabilities, yes, I will definitely bring that up. Is it kind of blurry? Sorry about that. Yeah, I'll definitely bring up the, okay. But yeah, if there are any versions that, with vulnerabilities that exist out there, that's going to be one of the first things you're going to kind of like, jump on. If you Google that version and it has an existing exploit, that's one of the first things that you may want to look into for sure. Which kind of leads into what I would say is one of the most fun phases, right? The exploitation phase. Not to say that you don't want to take the previous two phases. If anything, the previous two phases, like to me, are the most important, because if you haven't taken enough time to really identify that information of what type of services, then you could be wasting a bunch of time in the exploitation phase. You don't want to just kind of like throw stuff up. It might even be potentially dangerous, because it might, if you're just kind of throwing exploits out there, you could DDoS the the service, which can cause further damage to business on the client side. So here are just a few examples. There are many other ways. So one of the things that it talks about is authentication bypass. So I know what it is. Let me see some of y'all in your kind of own definition what this would be referring to. Spoiler alert, it's on the screen. Is there a machine in this? Yeah. Let's go ahead and start this because it takes a minute. So as you can see, it stops the previous machine before. Only one kind of like lab machine can be run at a time. But basically, you're going to have your authentication, like login screens, so there are definitely like many different ways to bypass those. And here it just mentions a few. One of the big one is the insecure direct object references, IDOR, and just this vulnerability alone takes you down like its own path, which is pretty cool. But yeah, let's see more of the hands-on. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, SQL injection can definitely lead to authentication bypass for sure. Yeah, so like a big one on that is, if it's like, does the username equal this and password equal this? Well, if you think about how that query works at the database level, and you just say like, and true, basically like regardless of what you have before, it will that statement will equate to true, i.e. just log me in. So if that was like kind of over your head, yeah, no worries. There's different levels here, but yeah, SQL injection, check it out. Okay, so log in. We found a little bug. Log in with the username Tom Jones and the password, access another user's information. Are there anything related to Android or mobile offensive? I have to double check. I'm not 100% sure on that. Get me after this and we'll figure it out. Okay, so again, there are different ways to do this one. This one's a little more involved because kind of one way to do this is to use burp, which I don't have running. Where's the it takes a little bit of time to kind of like set up. Might have to come back to this one. Yeah, so this whole module, takes a couple of hours. So we're kind of like really condensing it here. But basically what you want is you want the data between the browser, which is your client, and the server to be proxied or to travel through Burp Suite, which is this software. So that way you can kind of look at and or manipulate the packets. Where's the? So I'm like super zoomed in. I might have to zoom out just to have these settings, and then we can jump back in. Where's my mouse? Oh yeah, that's right. I don't have the plugin. Why? I don't need the plugin. Where's what was it? It's port 8080. Yeah, I could use Burp browser. Sorry, I'm reading over the chat. Okay. So this may be what was the 192? Oh, it's the same IP. Okay, so what we did there was we told, like I said, the web browser, well, to go through a proxy. Again, if this is kind of too much, there might have to be like additional knowledge. But it's going to capture the packets that are going from the client to the server and back, and it's basically going to kind of show you. So here's that those header information that we talked about earlier. So if we were to forward that, so here we have that login screen. Jones, not unusual. Did I get that right? All right, so we submit that. So here we can see the username and the password fields being sent to the server. And here we have a user ID. Which is, it's kind of cool because if there's a user ID field, it could be manipulated. So what if we tried a different user ID, like 2? Well, that presents us with a much different user. So this is definitely one way to kind of bypass some of those. There's our flag. Some of those like authentication. So clearly we didn't know Kenneth Force's password, but we were able to access it because the server takes in that user ID to send, whatever user is going to say, okay, this is the user ID, here's the information that we need. But if we change it, as you saw through the burp proxy, then we can pull up other users that exist. So pretty neat stuff. Session hijacking, very similar to what we just did. It's just a slightly different method. So instead of using burp in this instance, you're going to use the URL. Yeah, I forgot to zoom in. Oh yeah, we need to turn that off. There we go. Yeah, so if you don't turn off your proxy, it's just going to keep running and intercepting your traffic. This start. So once again, it tells us to log in and then hijack the administrator session. Oh. Where do I have back here? Being zoomed in doesn't always help. All right. Was it not? not unusual. Okay, so here we have a parameter called session ID. And then there's a number, and it essentially is like, okay, well, what if we gave it a different number? Well, there's a different user. Let me zoom in. Oops. So yeah, this is all part of, I mean, you know, we're doing this manually, but you can definitely automate this with Burp to provide, you know, just different, you know, everything from like 1 to 10,000 or whatever. So there we go. Now we kind of like session hijacked the administrative user. Is anyone lost? I'm trying not to go too fast, but we don't have a lot of time. What resources are there to read more, like how bad guys are government users? I've just been browsing half a day. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of resources out there that, you know, clearly we're one, but yeah, there definitely are other resources. Business logic flaw, that's one of my favorite actually. So I'm not going to start this one. I guess I could. But yeah, so basically you want to think about what is the expected output. So, you know, if the expected output is numbers, and, you know, a prudent person, you know, would provide like, okay, how many quantities of this object do you want? You know, you're going to want somewhere between 1 and 50 or whatever, most likely, or whatever. In other words, it's going to be a positive number. Well, what if you provide a 0 or a negative number? How is the server going to react to that? You know, is the server configured? You know, will it error out and provide information, or is it, you know, there are different ways that, you know, a server can, or, you know, a piece of software can react. And really that's what this kind of refers to. And we'll see once this loads up. So, you know, renew your subscription for $0 or less. Oops, we're going to use Burp with this one. Did it? Okay, so let's go back here. Refresh. Yep. Okay, so renew our subscription. Did it say? Yeah, it didn't really say anything. Okay, so I mean, you know, we'll just Canada.force or whatever. Whatever, it doesn't, the numbers don't really matter. I mean, there could be input validation, but in our case, let's just do that. So there's that amount, and I was like, okay, well, what if we just change that to 0? You see it, it's got a username parameter, credit card parameter, and an amount parameter. We just change it to 0. Well, there you go. We just renewed for free. So that's just kind of an example of like business logic. Obviously, you know, it's pretty rudimentary, but yeah, business logic flaws are one of my favorite to actually work through. So really the last two parts, the last two section is like, okay, well, you know, you have all these exploits, and ultimately it's going to lead to, or it could lead to data exfiltration. So whether that's, you know, sensitive credit card numbers, or, you know, other information that you can use for lateral movement, or, you know, future attacks. Right. So you've gained access to the database, and now you have maybe users or credentials that you can reuse, you know, in more serious situations, it may lead to RC or remote code execution, where you can actually run commands on the system itself. So, you know, that web server exists on, you know, on an operating system. So if you're able to run commands, like that's, you know, that's pretty cool. But yeah, whether you gain a shell or you you know, or you move laterally or whatever it may be, which kind of leads into the post exploitation. So once you've kind of like gained some kind of access, you know, one of the you're going to do one of three things, or all of them. Persistence. So access is big, right? You've gained access, you don't want to lose access. So you want to have multiple ways. So whether that's creating a new user to be able to log back in, or some kind of other, here it talks about SSH key. Others, you're creating a new user, add our SSH key. So you just want to identify ways to where, like, if you lose for whatever reason, like let's say the website goes down, right? You still want to have access to that system once you've gained. So you want to like identify or like, you know, create other ways to where you can have access to that system again. Privilege escalation. So, you know, you go from a regular user to administrative or system root. So, you know, that's also, I mean, it comes with its own, you know, kind of like responsibilities. You don't always necessarily need to have root. If you've, you know, gotten what you need, you know, you don't want to, like, if you think of it from like a defensive perspective, if you exploit and you get, you know, root access, it might set up some flags. So it's like, if you don't need to, just, you know, just hang out at regular user. If you've achieved what you need to achieve, there's no reason to risk, you know, alerting. But I mean, this kind of gets into like, you know, kind of like red teaming. And then finally, you know, pivoting. So, you know, sometimes, let's say the database, you know, can communicate, like the traffic can communicate to the web server, but you can't necessarily communicate with the database directly. But if you now have access to the machine that the web server lives on, you know, that's potential for you pivoting to the database system, or, you know, the whatever system the database lives on. So it just depends on how they're segmented off. Firewalls play a big point, you know, a big point there. So like once you're inside, you know, one system that now you all of a sudden have access to other systems, this would be, you know, a good way to like pivot into other systems that normally you wouldn't have access from the outside. And that's what pivoting comes from. Finally, everyone's most favorite is reporting. And we kind of talked about reporting earlier, but yeah, it's the big thing here that it talks about knowing your audience. So you want to adjust, you want to cater, whether you're talking to like the IT team, your language is going to be a little bit different as opposed to like if you're talking to, you know, the executive. You know, at the executive level, their concern is more like business impact. You know, the IT team, they want to know, you know, like the nitty gritty details, like, okay, you know, what are some things that I can action on? So you just want to get to see like, okay, who's your audience? That way, you know how to word your findings. Classifying vulnerabilities. Same thing. If, you know, more than likely you're going to identify like a ton of things, right? And, you know, you're not going to find a place where it's like, okay, you know, we're going to tackle everything. So you want to prioritize some things, right? So, hey, here, these, you know, these items are, you know, out of from 1 to 10, you know, or low to high, however, whatever scale you use, you know, high priority, medium priority, low priority. So that way, you know, different departments will kind of tackle that differently. Maybe they want to get all the low ones first, and then, start, go to the high, or maybe they want to tackle some of the high ones first. But at the end of the day, you want to present the data to where you can kind of help them prioritize, so that way they know how to move forward. And then finally, assessing impact and security. Again, it kind of leads to that whole, okay, there's this vulnerability, but if it's like a low impact, like maybe it just reveals the fact that, I don't know, it's running, I don't know, Apache and nothing else. When there's thousands of servers that run Apache, you know what I mean? So maybe it's not that big of a deal that it just reveals that information, as opposed to like, no, I can identify the username. Like that's a little bit of a higher, severity, because then I can use that username to brute force. So you just kind of want to like identify like, okay, what's the level of impact? What's, how severe is this vulnerability? So yes, in that burp request, you could see the password in clear text because I was using the proxy. Yes. Normal behavior, I would say nowadays, you're likely not going to see that. You might see that in like, like a training environment, just to kind of understand what's going on, like the concept. But you're not going to see a password in clear text, like you did here. It's much less likely, but it can happen. Okay, so we kind of skipped a few questions because these are just kind of like research. I mean, things you can, pretty much Google. But yeah, so any other questions? Yeah, absolutely. If you do have questions, I'm on LinkedIn. I was tagged in the post. I lurk on Discord, so feel free to look for me on there. But yeah, I hope everyone got something out of this. Other than that, have a good Friday, and take it easy. See you next time. Go jump into the office hour. Take it easy.